So functional groups are a way we have to study organic molecules. So we don't study organic molecules, organic compounds one by one. We study the behavior of functional groups. And this slide contains some of the most common ones, and specifically some of the most common ones that have applications in industrial applications, or they have a role in life and environmental sciences. In a more biological sense rather than maybe a more chemistry or pharmaceutical sense. You've got compounds that only contain carbons and hydrogens, or carbons, hydrogens, and X halogen, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. And we tend to call them hydrocarbons because they're made of carbon and hydrogen, and you will have got some names in future slides. And we have something called aromatic compounds. And aromatic compounds is when you have, well, in general, not always, when you have this structure, the structure of benzene, the 3 alternated double bonds. And we will look at how that structure is particularly important. I've got some slides later on, and you might have already come across this. It is not uncommon that instead of drawing the 3 alternated double bonds in particular positions, because they are actually not in particular carbons, but they are spread, those double bonds are kind of, those electrons are spread across those 6 carbon atoms, that we draw a circle. So rather than the 3 alternated double bonds, we draw a circle. And more about it in a future slide. We also have lots of functional groups containing oxygen, either with a single bond or with a double bond. We call that a carbonyl group. And finally, we also have functional groups that contain nitrogen and sometimes oxygen too. And these are the most typical ones. These are called amines. And these are called amides. So here are the functional groups that I showed you in the previous slide, but with the names. We have alkanes, which are carbon-carbon single bonds, alkenes, in which you have at least 1 carbon-carbon double bonds, and alkynes, in which you have at least 1 carbon-carbon triple bonds. And people will talk about the alkyl groups and alkenyl groups and alkynyl groups. Especially the alkyl groups are very common, a common way of talking about alkanes. We also have halo compounds or alkyl halides. So halo carbons, or they're sometimes alkyl halides. And this X is, as I mentioned in a previous slide, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine. We also have alcohols, in which you have the carbon attached to an oxygen, which is attached to a hydrogen. Ethers, in which you have an oxygen in between 2 carbons. It looks a bit like the structure of water, but instead of having an oxygen between 2 hydrogens, it's an oxygen in between 2 carbons. We have, this is called a carbonyl group. Carbon double bond oxygen is what you call a carbonyl group, and you will see it's all over the place. It's quite a few structures that have them. You can have aldehydes, in which your carbonyl group is at the end of a chain attached to hydrogen, or in the middle of 2 carbons, and then you have a carbon, a ketone. You can have a carboxylic acid group, or a carboxyl group, or a carboxylate groups. There are several ways you can call this structure, which is this one here. So a carboxylic acid, carboxyl group, or carboxylate. You can have an ester, in which you have lost the hydrogen, and in turn you has the oxygen attached to a carbon. And you can have amines, in which you have the nitrogen atom, or amides, in which you have a carbonyl group and a nitrogen next to each other. So you will see that you have functional groups, and you talk about alkanes and alkenes and alkynes, or ethers or esters, etc. And you sometimes use alkyl, to talk about the specific group, rather the specific, oh, there is an alkyl group in my molecule, or my molecule is an alkane. There is a carbonyl group in my molecule, or my molecule is an aldehyde, a ketone, a carboxylic acid, an ester, etc. When you have an alcohol, this is actually a funny group. When you can have a molecule that is an alcohol, for example, ethanol. But if you're talking about the OH in a structure, we talk about the hydroxyl group. Oh, I have a hydroxyl group in my molecule. So you will see that it can be a bit confusing. You will have to get used to this way of naming compounds, but it is very common, and you will see it in all chemistry books and papers that have to do with organic compounds. Either call a compound like this is an alcohol, or talk about the specific functional group as, oh, I have a hydroxyl group in my molecule, or I have an alkene, my molecule is an alkene, or oh, I have two alkenyl groups in my molecule.